Hello again. It's been quite a while. I don't really plan to post a lot of videos, if any at all. But in the the last uh, few videos I posted before this break, I alluded to the concept of coordinated coercion, which I'd sort of experienced in the investigations that I'd looked into in the FCA's failings over WealthTek, and also the extraordinary corruption that rests behind the promotion of private assets, and you could argue as well, being the trading venue of this, the Pisces platform, which you may have read some about last week. It's probably there's been an escalation in this. This is why I've posted this video. It's possibly worth going back in time to put this into context. Now, when the story on WealthTek broke, I think it was April 23, and clearly at that time I was a little disappointed in the FCA because I'd warned them prior, and I'd sort of contacted them and said, Fia, firstly, you've got to recognise you were wrong on this, and you need to apologise to the victims. And I also sort of gave them a heads up in the work we were doing around private assets, and there was some potential crossover between the two investigations. In particular, a common police constabulary that we have uncovered some fairly significant improprieties there, and so staying with the WealthTek situation, probably the best thing to do is to remind you how I think the two are linked, and how they sit with the secondary objective. And the secondary objective is, of course, using the financial services industry to promote the growth and competitiveness of the UK economy. Not in itself a bad ambition if it's done properly and within a properly reformed framework, which unfortunately I don't believe it is. Now, WealthTek is significant in that sense because such is the breadth of the FCA's failings, that, and I've covered this in previous videos, that they're desperate to suppress that, because effectively, if people knew what they were, the first thing people would say is there has to be reform of the system, and people don't want to reform. The government and the previous government the same don't want to reform the system because they're pushing for growth. Reform takes time, and to give you an example of this, I mean, they've intimidated the media and individuals not to cover it. I'll give you an example, say, of this. Last week, you may have seen, I think there was an article where it focused on the finfluencers and said because of court backlogs, these trials can't come into play until 2027. Which is the same as if you look at the WealthTek timeline, which I had actually warned people that this would happen earlier on in these videos. Now, why was the finfluencer brought up and WealthTek not? I'll try to explain that now. You'll have your own ideas of whether we have a free press and free speech in the UK. I personally don't think we do. You're entitled to your opinion. When it comes to the media, I clearly scan it. I'd be remiss not to, but I see it as a source of a kind of information, not a source of knowledge. Again, people can use it as they wish. But if you look at the finfluencer, why they wanted to highlight that, not WealthTek, because it looks like they're on the front foot. So it says the FCA have identified this problem, which indeed they have. They're right, actually, on this. So we've tackled these people who are pushing crypto and other dicey stuff without outside of regulatory frameworks. They're absolutely right in doing that. So they want to talk about that, but WealthTek, they don't. And the reason they don't is because, in essence, there are a huge number of shortfalls on their part. So they talk about the one they want to and not the one they don't. There are other examples of this. You might see, where the media are whipped into line and told not to ask the awkward questions. One way, with where we have sort of young Ukrainian linked models. Probably the best way to describe it. I'm not going to go beyond that, how some other people have. But we have, three. I think it's three Ukrainian origin or linked to the Ukraine models who have allegedly attacked property that's associated with Keir Starmer. And now, what you would have noticed is, whether it be in Parliament or the media, nobody's been allowed to ask the obvious question, which is, are you acquainted with any of them? Do you know them? Is there any reason that you know of that they would want to attack property that's associated with you? They've since appeared in court. There's a complete lockdown on information. Nobody's allowed to report on it. So you can see how, when it suits, there's a different presentation of events. And I'm not saying I know why they did it. I'm not going beyond the fact that they're apparently Ukrainian-linked models, young males. Beyond that, I don't know. But I'm just giving you an example of how the media plays a game and it's told to, and so on and so forth. And it's the same, really, if you look at the speed of trials as well, because you have a situation where we're told there's court backlogs and it's 2027 and so on and so forth. But when there are offences that are immediately embarrassing to the government, the courts will work at lightning speed. And the concept of prejudice, which I've focused on a lot through these videos, is all of a sudden not as important. You saw that with the unrest that happened last summer. And I'm not supporting that unrest. I would support violence and damaging property and things like that. Absolutely not. But you can see how then the far right term came out really, really quickly, and these people were condemned before they even went to trial, and even if that included just social media posts. So you can see the arbitrary nature of the system, and the interesting thing here is with regards to the WealthTek situation, the threats that I kind of received on that side was, when I made it clear that I was very, very concerned about the conflicts of interest between the FCA as a regulator that I could see that failed catastrophically, and also acting as the prosecutor. I wanted to know more about how these conflicts of interest would be managed. I was very, particularly in the context that they'd issued a lot of misleading narrative to the public in terms of the expediency of their actions. I was also very concerned about when I started to push back on other things, and I covered this with the Anthony Williams narratives, where I wouldn't give a witness statement, and I didn't want to, because I required them to be more honest and candid with the public first, and I don't agree with the prejudice angle. And I've given you examples of how prejudice is manipulated depending on what the objective is. He sort of came back and said, essentially that when I said, look, I need to chat to or have some dialogue with the court and the other side of the case, to let them know what my concerns are. In essence, it came back saying, that we can use whatever you say, whatever you write, whatever you provide in whatever way we choose, without any way I understood it, without any consultation with you, which is very, very clear that would sit way outside of the European Convention on Human Rights, because you'd be effectively had unlimited, unfettered means of presenting something without the consent or knowledge of the person that you've taken that information from, and that just wouldn't sit with any recognition of a fair trial. So that was one way I pushed back, and then they try to coerce you and say that you're not providing information and not cooperating, and trying to prejudice the investigation and case, and so on and so forth. Interestingly, that was backed up with Duncan Alga, where he sort of came back after the transparency partnership, or I can't remember what the terms are now, but when I took part in their book club event, he came back and said, we've tried to contact Mr. Stockdale and he hasn't cooperated, which is absolute nonsense. I've actually given them quite a lot of information, and it's that is like what I call the pincer coercion that they try to provide when you won't completely submit to them, and when you start questioning some of their methods, they try to say that you're going to prejudice, and they try to say that you're not cooperating. So they're trying to put pressure on you and say, effectively, we'll wreck your career if you don't do exactly what we tell you. They're trying to bully and threaten you. Now, incidentally, strangely enough, after the Lost to the Races book, there's been two instances where people have come to me with what looks to be like significant information, and I have actually been in terms of working with other people, made sure that information is available to the FCA, and that's not at all to create trouble at all. It is actually an obligation to, within the bounds of reasonableness, to cooperate, and I have done that. And ironically, the first example, if they'd have followed what I told them, both before the discovery, during my interview and information afterwards, they'd have found that very easy, and without being too disparaging, I would expect someone about year 9 level to have been able to make that connection and find the information that subsequently they were given as a result of the book Lost to the Races. Of course, the other coercion is actually during the interview, when the two investigators have been put in a difficult position, because I don't actually think that they're particularly bad people at all. I think the system is bad rather than them. They were clearly sent to try to bounce me into giving a witness statement and to warn me off my own investigative work, because I think they'd started to work out that I was probing around and looking at why, the extent of these failings and so on. And that took place at the end of the interview with one of them, and the other one when I was in a sort of like communal area of Malmaison, and he kind of approached and he saw I was looking at my phone and said, look, we don't want you doing your own investigation. So it was like that, but I don't think, I think they were just kind of bounced into it and told to do that. They weren't particularly unreasonable people. I think the people behind them were probably a little bit more nefarious myself. That would be the way I'd read it. And that it's because of this situation. I think what's going to happen is they've got to what they're going to try to do is they're going to try, I would imagine, put together a case which kind of makes it look like, John, and in that respect, there are any allegations. So, I'm not making any firm statements here. I'm just giving really a hypothetical situation, as I say it. They're going to try and put together, because with the breadth of these failures, which, as I've said before, possibly would look very embarrassing even in a frontier market, which is clearly won't do with it when you're trying to, show the system as being world class, and when you can then consider the secondary objective. Essentially, what they're going to try and do is say, I think, is that he developed some sort of master code or some ingenious system where it was near impossible for anyone to see, and that's why this came about, and they want to then take it to the trial. They'll try to get the result they want, and then shortly after the trial, if they're successful, they'll put a small paragraph saying, well, this was a big case, we did this, that, and the other, all this sort of narrative that they've already used, and then say there may have been one or two other things that we could have done slightly better, but we fixed the system and so on and so forth, and then just put it all to bed. Now, I suspect the other side. Now, I'll say, in my knowledge of John, clearly I had my suspicions. I reported them. It's very disappointing. I think it's always going to come back to where was the money. But if I don't, the conclusion I sort of come to, I kind of thought that he may have taken the wrong direction, and the whole thing metastasized and got greatly out of control. I don't think he's a uniformly bad person at all, and I know that might upset a few people, but it's not meant to. I think he's actually capable of a lot of good in the right circumstances, I suspect what we have here is a situation where he's not willing, the way I would see it, to be framed in that situation I just described, where he's just some sort of master villain, and there's no way the FCA could have known, and it was all his fault, and so on and so forth. And I'm not excusing if the allegations are proven, not excusing that behaviour at all. But I think it's clearly, as I always said, to understand one, you need to understand the other. So two sides of the same coin: the allegations and the catastrophic failures of the FCA. And I think it's quite possible from his side he can see that it isn't all black and white, and he's not willing to take the blame, if indeed there is a blame to be assigned on everything, and play a narrative where he was some sort of master villain, and the FCA, there's no way that they could have spotted any of this, and so on and so forth. So I that's the way I kind of read it. And I think also the other significant part is the assets are in the restraint order. I from what I've been able to drive, that clearly there may be some dispute over who owns those, and I won't really go into that, but I think there has been a certain dialogue from the defence side in how these assets could have been administered a lot better in terms of preserving their value, be it to be one beneficiary or another. And clearly there are disputes over who ultimately owns those and funded them. But I'll leave that for now. And what I could deduce potentially that advice was scoffed at, and the administration of them has been very chaotic and to the detriment of preserving the value to whoever goes on to be able to benefit from that value, and I think that is undoubtedly some part as well. And I think as well, when you look at it, having looked at the private asset stuff, where that also includes quite a lot of analysis of legal professionals and so on and so forth, I think you've got a situation where clearly a lot of the things, as difficult as these situations are, there's always a solution, but it requires two sides to understand where they've gone wrong and to come to an honest conclusion and a just conclusion. And that can be done, or you can also look at it and think, well, what's the incentive from the legal professionals to do that? Because you've got from now till September 2027, and there'll be multiple case management hearings during that time, which will be which will be quite lucrative. Then you've got this bonanza bullet payment at the end, which is your trial, which will last several weeks. And I suspect there's a way of which that could be avoided and a solution found in terms of it trying to recognize the situation and also doing it in a way where the clients who are the most important people put at the forefront. And I think this could be done without that, and it's quite clear in some ways, but the commercial motivations and also the motivations to keep this out of the press for as long as possible are, in the context of the secondary objective, are major obstacles to that. And that's my reading of the situation from what I can understand. I mean that's unfortunately when you have reputations and you have legal professionals who the financial cases like this are extremely lucrative, and that's always going to play a part. In terms of swinging on to the other, I've mentioned quite a lot about private assets and the work I've done on that, and to give you some idea, it's about understanding the desire for private equity to have a bigger chunk of the public sector, and there are two main areas they focus on. It's vulnerable people and healthcare, because they're very, very interested in those because they're government backed. As long as the UK manages to remain solvent, government backed cash flows for a long period of time. So passing vulnerable people from typically local authorities through a legal process and then into the administration of their situations, circumstances by private equity owned agencies, because then effectively your individuals become cash generative assets. And similarly with healthcare as well, that's a very, very lucrative area. And if you look very, very carefully at Wes Streeting, and this is not talking conspiracy now, if you look at his relationship with private equity in terms of the funding of his career as well, you can see the links there. And what you're going to see is when they push out this narrative where waiting lists are falling, nobody really ever verifies these stats. I'm always very suspicious of them, or the number of appointments rising. The solution to that will be a bigger role for private equity. It's been going on a long time. It's back in the Blair era, and it's just grown and grown and grown and grown. But it's very sensitive, and it doesn't really sit in public markets too well because of the transparency that's required in public markets. So what you tend to see is that that means that to realise their value, they kind of have to trade these businesses amongst themselves at quite subjective valuations. Now, there is one way which you can then expand it is if you open up an avenue to people's savings under the banner of private assets, which people will access via their pension funds and investment funds. A proportion will be allocated to this, whether you like it or not. They then need a trading venue, and that's when your Pisces platform comes in, because effectively then you expand in the market, more capital in that area, so private equity can then finance a bigger role in the public sector. Social care and healthcare will be the ones that they're aiming at, and new influx of capital from retail investors via their pension providers and investment fund providers accessing private assets. They can then be traded on this Pisces platform, which doesn't require much transparency, and then you can carry on. Because if you imagine really the model, if it were up to scrutiny and people would be comfortable with what they're doing, would be very, very conducive to the public markets, because they can say we've got all these recurring revenues, but people want to dig down at how these revenues occur. And as I've kind of said, is this model is prevalent in social care and healthcare, and in particular, it's rife in immigration as well, and it's rife in and it was very prolific in the rape gangs issue. And if you look at what's happened there, I'll try and frame this for you. I mean, I mentioned in the previous videos that you had Rupert Lowe, who was running this investigation inquiry, he's. I'm going to stay away from the ethnic side. I'll leave other people to do that. But he is, he's generated some momentum, and what that's prompted the government to do, is they've had to backtrack and announce their own initiative, because effectively they knew they were losing the narrative. So you need to take the narrative back. And I covered this with when I looked at the perversion of prejudice, and I briefly touched on the Southport issue. Is what they will then try to do is they will take it down an avenue of what I would call managed accountability. And managed accountability is kind of they'll appoint a KC, very decent budget, they'll gorge on that. And they'll look and they'll think, well, we've got to identify a couple of scapegoats so that to give the public some red meat to make it look like it's real, and then the rest of it they will just manage through time, and they'll steer it away from legal professionals, they'll steer it away from politicians, and they'll try and stick it on some managers and social workers and maybe the odd council official. But what you've got to realise is the any sort of social worker they get and they highlight and say they've done this and that and the other, their actions would have been likely endorsed by a legal professional in-house, but they'll want to protect that legal professional, because what they don't want is to see is effectively a number of these girls were taken through the care system and effectively traded through onto private equity owned agencies who paid scant regard for their care, but took a lot of money in doing it. And effectively your legal professionals and your court officials take a cost of carry in that trade, and they're desperate to make sure you don't see that, because effectively that's what private assets is going to be funding. Private assets will essentially be dressed up quite nicely in terms of with the Pisces platform and private assets. You'll be funding fast growing businesses and so on and so forth, and get ownership of them and blah. And there will be an element of that, but behind it will be this trade. And you will see, and it's exactly the same you see in immigration. So when you see, again, I'm going to stay away from the ethnicity. I don't want to get involved in that, leave that for others. But when you see, images of boats arriving, and people say, another 1,000 people arrived on the South Shores of England today, and so on and so forth. What in essence, you can look at it. I mean, I think the majority of them come for a better life, and there will be some bad actors in there. But let's leave that aside. But each one of those is an asset. That person would have been an asset to the traffickers who facilitated their transportation here, and they're an asset when they get here. And they're an asset they will go through a similar process, local authorities, court system, and then ultimately private equity owned institutions or accommodation providers who will administer their care, and when they're under administration, their asylum cases, and so on and so forth. And so it's no coincidence that there isn't solutions being found, because if you look at the current government, in some ways it's headed by somebody who made an enormous amount of money from that system in human rights cases and so on. And that's where you will also be conned as well, because people will say, and you hear, and as I said, you hear this from multiple people. They'll say, right, we need to leave the European Convention of Human Rights because we'll magically solve it. That's just complete and utter nonsense. It's a diversion. There are lots of countries who manage immigration very successfully by following this framework. Now, what the problem is in Britain is the gross distortion of it and the perversion of it. And you'll have a wide extreme. One level, you will have courts and authorities who believe they have supremacy to it and will just ignore it. The example of that I've given you is in the WealthTek situation, where I sort of said, look, I'm very concerned here, where I need some assurances how this certain key body of evidence is going to be presented, because what happens if that evidence has striking examples of the failings of the regulated prosecutor, and you need to understand those failings to be able to understand the allegations made. To what extent are how are these conflicts going to be managed? And then that was completely shut down, because I said, well, it needs to now be managed within European Convention of Human Rights framework. And also in terms of me, when I said, look, I can't help you in the legal process, because in my mind you misled the public, and you need to be honest, and I can't in good faith work with a regulated prosecutor who I don't believe is communicating in a clear and honest way. And they kind of and throughout that dialogue, I got the impression that they just thought they had complete supremacy. It just didn't matter. Oh, we comply with it. How do you comply? I don't see it. Because strangely, when I brought up the global case in Loss of the Races, there was scathing criticism of the FCA's handling of that from a court within the European Union, and that was just brushed under the carpet. Now, I'm not assuming the guilt or innocence of the accused in that case, but I could see that their methods, that they were very aggressive, and in this case as well. And I just needed to be assured that they were being done within the correct framework, and I didn't get that assurance. But then you'll get the other side, going back to perversion of the ECHR, is you'll get the most spurious defense against somebody whose asylum case or whatever has run its course. It's not been accepted, and somebody will come up with an extraordinary weak case under the framework of why they can't be sent back to their country of origin. So it's almost like the gross perversion of this legislation, this framework, that is the problem. It's not the legislation itself, and people who tell you differently are conning you. Now, going back to what I've said to you about this private assets in terms of the own work. Now, I haven't really had threats from the FCA recently, because it's not really where I'm putting my attention. But the threats indirectly have come around a different source. So we've had them from a local authority. I mean, when you look at these cases, you look for patterns, and then when you found the patterns, you have to drill down on a few sort of micro ecosystems at the local authority level. We've been doing that, and it started to get some. Because I don't know if front this stuff, but for a variety of reasons, I have this occasion. I've been working on sort of investigation work since 1997. I kind of fell into it. Always done it separate and to my day-to-day work. Don't take money from it. It's done in the name of a course and things like that. Really, cause really not ready to make money. If money comes, I don't see it, and it's kind of held and it's used to fund other investigations if it's not given away. I've started to get. I've had threats that it's been put to me that if I continue with my investigations, this will happen. And it's kind of funny because we actually had a conversation about this, and I put it to a representative of a local authority and said that you've actually threatened me in terms of both the private assets and the WealthTek side. So two parts of an investigation, you're threatening me that if they continue, you'll do this and that. And a recorded conversation was not denied. And all this evidence has been collated. It's held under trust. It's held under trust because it protects it from from sort of nefarious activity from legal people who try to make bully to get access to it. It ensures that it will be used how we feel it should be used and when we feel it should be used, and that will come out I think later this year, faster if we need it. You get this situation where initially it's quite a common pattern, whether it's a government organisation, an authority, a company, or any sort of charity or whatever enterprise it would be. You kind of start off where they say, well, you're talking rubbish, nothing, they'll ignore you, they won't take you seriously, they'll say you're just calling our bluff, and da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. And that carries on, and also they think, well, there's nothing you can do about it, so we'll just ignore you. And then all of a sudden there's a realization that you have got this data, and you have got this ecosystem which goes from here through this organization. There's legal professionals. It also incorporates court officials, and then it goes into private equity and organizations. You know who the investors are. They of the private equity organizations and the funds they use to structure their investments. You know that ultimately their investors in these co-invested funds don't actually know fully what's gone on in terms of the process of which these vulnerable people have been taken, and then they start to think, they do have they have actually got information, and they have probably been inside, and they know how these things are financed. Then the aggression starts, and that's when they start to try to threaten you, and that's really where we are on this. So it's not unusual. You have to remain calm. And it doesn't put us off. We've been here a long time, and we've seen these things before. So I just wanted to really provide this sort of update. It's kind of usual, confusing, because I did actually go back and say to the FCA, I'm not very impressed that I seem to be having this coordinated coercion and so on and so forth. And we may have to do something about this in terms of what we disclose and when. And they sort of came back and quite a polite way and said, well, maybe you should contact the police and so on and so forth. But it's not really viable to do that because the police in some ways are part of this, and we in terms of the common police force, the constabulary that I referenced, there's some extraordinary levels. Indeed, there are in this actually in terms of what we found. it's not only corruption, it's racism. It's horrendous as well, and it's a very different type of racism than is talked about with the rape gangs and immigration. This is quite shocking racism in terms of almost cleansing the well, actually it does include cleansing the heritage of people to ease that process, that trade from local authority into the hands of private equity. And this is what I think is awakening the threat. So clearly, when the police are involved in that to a certain degree, and the corruption in that, it doesn't make sense to go to the police, and that's not what we're doing. It'll be done very much in the public forum, within our own framework. And also, actually, what if the rape gang stuff is done properly, which I doubt it will, you would see that the police have many questions to answer in that, in terms of their role as well, in terms of what they did and what they didn't do. Anyway, that's enough for now. I've gone on. It's been unscripted. The reason that I put the video out is because there's been a step up in this, what I call coordinated coercion, and I thought an update was due. Take care.